Good evening. Good evening. I'm John Mika, the president of Founding Forward. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's public affairs program. As you all know, Founding Forward is the nonprofit organization that provides civic education to students and teachers from across the country, cares for the incredible history of the Union League of Philadelphia, and makes possible a better and more engaged citizenry across the United States. So I want to thank everyone who supports our work. We are now in the last month of our fiscal year. I know that many of you have contributed this fiscal year. I know some have not. If you're not sure who you are that has not, you will receive an email, and it's very simple. Just respond positively to that email, and you will be among those that support the work of Founding Forward. And I'm pleased and proud to announce today that Good Citizen Day, which has been happening here at the Union League since 1947, it's the oldest of our civic education programs, is going on the road. And we now have two that are formally scheduled. Good Citizen Day in Sacramento, California on September 22nd. Thank you. And in Manhattan on November 10th. So we have Good Citizen Day on the road, and we are working on more, hopefully at least one, maybe two more this coming academic year, and then we hope to get really big because we need it. So thank you for your support that makes all of that happen. A few housekeeping items for today. First of all, please take a moment and silence your cell phones. We will do Q&A with cards. You should have cards in front of you. Simply write your question down. Staff will come through and give them to the staff. We have some wonderful programs coming up. And next week, Jim Monday is coming back to the Union League of Philadelphia. For those of you who don't know, Jim was here for 45 years and is historian emeritus of Founding Forward. And I will have the pleasure of talking to Jim about the Union League during the American Civil War. And then June 18th, we have the first of several programs at Liberty Hill. And this one is on hate speech and the First Amendment with Joe Fornieri. So with no further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Sue Heindel, who will introduce our program for this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sue Heindel.
Thank you, John, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's panel. John Yoo is the Emanuel Heller Professor at Law at the University of California at Berkeley and just finished a visiting professorship in the New School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas at Austin. He has served in all three branches of government. He was a member of the U.S. Justice Department during the George W. Bush administration, served as general counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and clerked for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. John is a new senior fellow for Founding Forward, and he will be one of the scholars presenting at this summer's teacher seminar on the Constitution. Mary Kissel is executive vice president and senior policy advisor at Stevens, Inc., a leading independent financial services firm. She is also vice chairman of RXO, Inc., a director of QXO, Inc., and a non-resident senior fellow at Hudson Institute. Prior to joining Stevens, Mary served as senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and spent 14 years on the Wall Street Journal editorial board as chief foreign policy commentator in New York and editorial page editor for Asia Pacific based in Hong Kong. Our moderator is Edward Terzansky, a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Union League Life member, and Founding Forward board member. Founding Forward is honored to welcome John Yoo, Mary Kissel, and Ed Terzansky.
Thank you, Sue. Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? That's your problem. In all sincerity, Mary, John, thank you so much for making the time to be with us. We've got quite the topic to tackle. And to get us started, Mary, given that you had served under Secretary of State Pompeo in the first Trump term, and you've got, I think, a very wide-angle view on both sides of the lens, you're inside government and outside. Help us understand, is there a Trump doctrine, some unifying theory of foreign policy under Donald Trump? And if so, what is it? What are its components?
Thanks for that easy start, and I appreciate that. And thank you to the Union League Club for having me. It's really an honor to be here. It's my first time in the club, and it's just a treat to be here. So thank you very much. So the question really is, can you make order from chaos, or what looked like chaos? And I can speak to the first term, and the answer is yes. There actually was order in the chaos. And when I joined the secretary at Foggy Bottom, part of my job, so I was his right hand, so I traveled all around the world with him and did lots of things for him, but my main job is really to be his strategist and to think through the arguments that he was making over time. But in order to do that, you needed an intellectual foundation. So my first week there, I sat down and did exactly this and tried to answer that question, and I came up with a little paragraph for myself. And essentially what it said is that the president to that date, and this is October 2018, believed in something I called principled realism. And it meant that we weren't going to go on the neocon adventures of the Bush years, but nor was he the isolationist that I think he was typically tarred as. There was something in between, and he had an instinct about him that was very commonsensical, that we would exert power when we needed to, but we wouldn't let our allies off the hook, and we would ask them to do what was necessary in ways that we should have done since the end of the Cold War, and we just hadn't done. So that was part of it, but the other big part of it, and I'll stop here, is that the 9/11 era really ended under Donald Trump's first term. And what we did is we woke up and we said, gosh, there are lots of states out there that want to kill us. Russia, China, Iran. We need to wake up. Those threats never went away. We just ignored them during the war on terror. Didn't mean that terrorism went away or that it wasn't important to combat, but it shouldn't be the primary focus of our foreign policy. And so maybe I'll just end there and see if John wants to defend the neocon.
I'll tell you what, no, well, here's what we'll do with John, because there's a pretty significant legal thread that goes through the Trump foreign policy, at least in this administration. Immigration, tariffs. John, walk us through those threads, and specifically what Trump's interaction with courts has done to his ability to conduct foreign policy.
And thanks for also that easy question. But also it's great to be back at the Union League. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to come in from California and see the Philadelphia Inquirer spend pages and pages on what are we going to do with middle inning relief for the Phillies, and are the Eagles going to repeat at the Super Bowl? Yes, of course they are. I don't need to fly all the way here to read about that. But I think I'm thinking about what am I going to be remembered for this night? If you remember John F. Kennedy when he appeared in Paris as president, and he said, "I am the man who accompanied Jackie Kennedy to Paris." So I'm the person who got to sit next to Mary Kissel at her first appearance at the Union League. That's all I want to be remembered for. Plus, I took her to her first actual authentic Philadelphia soft pretzel today. She'd never had one in her entire life.
Spicy mustard.
John, you are a big spender. You know that?
It used to be 5 for $1. I don't know this 5 for $5 stuff that's going on here.
He didn't eat any carbs at all, but I did.
This is remedial culinary education for people from Florida. But actually, in all seriousness, the other great thing about Mary that you don't know is that she plays the triangle, which she calls a percussion instrument. And she was offered a place at the Curtis Institute and had never seen it before. So I took her by today, and we almost broke in successfully into the triangle exhibit, which was in square display cases. Anyway, so now you've forgotten that I have to talk about this subject.
John, what about the law?
Trump and the courts. But,
They let you in the courts?
judges love me because I tell jokes about what they're doing and no one else will. So Ed is right. There is this legal dimension to a lot of Trump's foreign policy, and he is getting extremely frustrated in the courts, and to the point where he attacked just on Friday personally a fellow named Leonard Leo, who was the head of what's called the Federal Society, which is this very important conservative legal organization that I would say has had a direct hand in the selection of Justices Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And he basically accused Mr. Leo of being a traitor to the United States and running things for his own interests, and it went on and on. I thought it was quite outrageous for a president who's very good at saying outrageous things. This was the most outrageous thing I'd heard him say. But the reason why he went off on that was because he just suffered a major loss in court on Thursday, about his tariff regime and the trade war he's trying to wage by trying to turn a law from 1977 called IEEPA, which was actually intended to restrain the president's economic sanctioning power. But Trump said, I can interpret it to allow us to impose worldwide tariffs, especially on China, Canada, and Mexico. And then, as you said, Ed, he's also been straining against the immigration laws. He's actually invoked a law from 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts, to try to be able to deport people already in our custody, to deport, and this is a case of Venezuelans, to deport them to El Salvador. So 2 observations about this. This is already a part of life where the president already has a kind of constitutional power he does not enjoy in domestic affairs. Right? Foreign affairs, it's almost like you could say the relationship of the branches are different. In domestic affairs, we expect Congress to go first, to set policy, and the president to carry out. In foreign affairs, we expect the president to act first, set foreign policy, and then fight with Congress about funding it and getting it done. Even in this area, Trump is straining against the constitutional norms we've had for many decades. And I would say if there was one way to understand what he's doing, I think, and he may not even understand he's doing this, I kind of compare the Trump White House to a gas molecule. Not because it smells bad, but because a gas molecule bounces all around, it seems randomly, right? But actually acts according to rules, that we can figure out, laws that we can divine if we study what seem to be random patterns. What he seems to be doing to me, even if he doesn't understand it, is he's trying to undo the Watergate reforms. He's trying to take the presidency back to the way it was when Nixon first took office. And if you look at, just to take the tariffs, for example, guess who the last president was that tried to impose universal tariffs on a claim of national emergency that the trade deficit was too large? Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon did exactly the same thing Trump is trying to do now.
Can I just
Please.
respond to that briefly? I think there is an argument that executive power has been really diminished and that this is a long overdue reassertion of executive branch authority. I think the question is, what's he going to do with the power this time around versus the first term? In the first term, there was a coherence to the foreign policy that I don't think that you see in the second term. Or if you see it in the second term, it might be a coherence that you don't like, and let me explain. In the first term, as I said, the 9/11 era ended. We clearly identified who the enemies were. We started to rally allies against them. And we achieved some really stunning success. Take just one example. Because of the Iran maximum pressure campaign, We gave comfort to nations in the Middle East and the Gulf to sign up to the Abraham Accords. One was not possible without the other. You would never have gotten the Abraham Accords without that pressure on Tehran and the recognition that Tehran was really the enemy and the source of all evil and the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East. We had clarity on the nature of the regime in Beijing, that they were an enemy, even though we didn't call them that. We called them a competitor, which was a mistake, I believe. And then we started to take steps to rally allies around them, like the Huawei campaign, where we went around the world and we said, get Huawei out of your system. It's not a telecommunications company. It's an intelligence company, period. They're snooping on you. Now, that coherence and that extension of power, that's continued to a degree, but its manner is changing and the focus of it is changing. Now Trump talks about being a peacemaker. I love peace as well, but not peace by appeasement. And it's trending in that direction, and that is very different from the first term, and there's a different set of people enacting the policy. And frankly, I think this is a more pure distillation of Trump and Trumpism than in the first term. I think he's following his instincts far more, and he's more enabled in the first term because he understands what the power of the presidency is in a way that he didn't the first time around.
So I agree with a lot of what Mary said. Let me give you the neocon perspective. I'm like one of the last few that are left. Someone
There's
called
three in
me-
the room tonight, so you're in good shape.
Oh, awesome. We're going to have what one friend of mine called a neocon conclave then. It's interesting. It's almost, I wouldn't say contradictory, but it's interesting the different dynamics of work. You have a president who's trying to exercise presidential power in a way it has not been exercised since the early 1970s. It really reminds me more of Kennedy and Johnson in the 60s. At the same time, it's to achieve a policy that itself is not exuberant. It's not self-confident. In fact, I would say, if you look at a historical parallel and the way they think, the neoconservative perspective is that it's not actually true. But I think they think they are in the post-World War II world, but the world of Great Britain, a world that a country that had an empire and has now entered a period of declining resources where they can't afford to pay for it anymore. So you look at what's their initial focus, it's retreating back to the Western Hemisphere and beating up on countries like Panama and Greenland and trying to reestablish a hegemony over Latin America. That has always been the sort of minimal foreign policy of the United States since Monroe. But at the same time, talking about withdrawing from Europe, right? Talking about not paying for treaty organizations, not paying for anybody else's defense. That's very much, I think, a sign that they believe they're in a period, just like Churchill after World War II, where they don't think they can pay for the commitments we have anymore. I tend to think, as a neocon, I tend to think that's a mistaken view of our position and the position in the world. I agree with Mary. I think really the number one threat to the country is China. I think all the other issues sort of fade away compared to the threat that China poses, but it's only a threat for the next 10 years because they're about to enter such a demographic decline that all we have to do is contain them for another decade, and then things are going to dramatically turn in our favor.
How likely are we to see China act within the Trump administration against Taiwan?
Oh, I think the test happened with their actions toward the Philippines. And I'm shocked that this doesn't get more attention or press coverage because we don't have a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. We have a treaty with the Philippines. And this started under the last few years of the third term of President Obama. That was a joke. And it's continued in the second term of Trump. And that is a direct test of the resolve of the United States to defend an ally. And we have not done very much, although Secretary of Defense Pete, I think, gave a pretty good speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore just in these last few days. I actually think that the more relevant question may be, what are they going to do here in the United States? I don't think it's a problem over there. I think it's a problem here. The infiltration, and actually, Secretary Pompeo gave a speech to the National Governors Association. He did it deliberately to a bipartisan group to raise this very question of the infiltration of our institutions, their ability. They can shut down all of our network infrastructure right now. They can read all your text messages and they can listen to all your phone calls. Did anybody know that? Anybody in the audience know that? Yeah, this is a really educated crowd. Wow, it's awesome. Usually I ask and no one raises their hand. But we always think about the last war, and I think that's a mistake. I think the conflict is going to be here. They're going to do something here to enable them to do something over there. Or, conversely, if they do decide to do something in their near abroad, it's going to be Japan that gets involved. And we have a defense treaty with Japan, and that's how we'll get involved in the fight. But China picks fights everywhere in the region, so don't just focus on Taiwan.
So why didn't we act in the Philippines?
We're very slow to act. There are many of examples throughout our history where we are surprised by threats. It's actually a great part of our nature, right? We're a lumbering beast. But my fear is that...
Admiral Yamamoto said sleeping giant sounds much better.
I liked my phraseology, but... In any event, I think that it will take a real tragedy. But think about, for instance, ISIS. When did we act against ISIS? It wasn't until Americans were beheaded on television. But it had been going on for months and months and months. I mean, they had an actual state within a state. And my fear is that the threat is so large to us that we might have something really bad happen and not have time to recoup and react in ways that we did in prior conflicts. But I don't want to be a downer, and I'm much more fun at dinner parties.
The optimistic version is Bismarck. Bismarck said about that God favors three kinds of people: alcoholics, children, and the United States of America. We are enormously lucky in waiting for the threats to mature before we do anything, but that's because, I think, because of our democratic system it places a lot of roadblocks for decisive action, and the American people, they will not get roused to action unless they get angry, and they usually don't get angry until America's been attacked. That's not necessarily wise, because you don't stop threats early, which would be better, but at the same time, once we get engaged, we go to win. China, they're very difficult. I didn't answer Ed's immigration issue, really, and I just should have pointed out, because you raised this. I think that the two national security elements of immigration, but also where he's getting so much resistance, is the southern border. Because if you want to think, what's the primary national security objective of the federal government, is to secure the borders, and he's done that quite successfully. And the second thing is, I agree with Mary. If you look at where foreign students are coming from right now in the universities, there are over 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States every year. And I asked a Chinese student about this once. I said, how many of them do you think they're spies? Because if I was in Ed's former line of work, I would put a lot of spies in that flow of students. And she said, 1 out of every 10 of us is a spy. And I said, how do you know that? Why 1 out of 10? She said, because it's been that way since kindergarten. 1 out of every 10 in any Chinese class works for the Chinese Communist Party. When the Chinese say something's a party school, it has a different meaning over there than it does here, right? But they actually send spies in that 300,000. I mean, 30,000 is probably too high, but it could be 30,000, and they are watching the other students, they're watching us, and they are taking, I think, scientific and technological secrets back to China. And so I think ultimately the immigration war, like the tariff war, is going to become more focused on China, even though he didn't intend it to start that way. I think it'll have the most support on Capitol Hill and within the agencies if it's focused on China.
Yeah, but can I just clarify? We should be really clear about terms. When you say spy, it's actually 10 out of 10, because you can't just count the people that work for MSS and those agencies, because every student has leverage against them back in China, meaning their families. So I had multiple students who would say, I want to take that Tiananmen Square class, but don't put me on your class roster, don't film me, don't call my name at all. So effectively, they all have to report back to Beijing, whether they want to or not, because they don't want mom and dad sent off to a work camp in Xinjiang. And that's why this threat is so difficult to define, because it's not black and white like the Soviet period, and we're economically integrated with them in a way that we weren't during the Soviet era. And we're not calling them an adversary yet. We call them a competitor, because we're in this middle weird gray space, and government isn't giving business and the investment community clear guidelines about what they can and can't do unless they're selling missile technology, right? Obviously, we're not going to sell that to them. So it's a difficult problem to solve, and I don't think it's an easy one to solve. But just to be clear, this is a country that has a nuclear program that we have no insight into, bio and chemical weapons programs, world's largest navy, third largest air force, million-man army. They cut underseas cables, they're flying stuff above our head, and they attack our satellites every day. So you put that all together, this should be the focus of our foreign policy. And in Trump 2, it's not. It's really not. The president is focused on making peace in Ukraine, in Gaza, with Iran. And my fear is that he's going to get sucked into talks with Beijing and try to make peace or stabilize that relationship. And we're going to waste these next 3.5 years, and I hope that I'm wrong.
I do want to get back to the transactional nature of Trump's personal relationships. But first, John, Secretary Rubio has been, to my thinking, the most clear thinker and the clearest representative of the concern about foreign nationals coming into the United States to engage in bad behavior that's injurious to our national interests. And it seems like the administration has not had much success with inferior courts in exercising this power. What has to happen? Is the Supreme Court ever going to get to the point of saying, enough of this, we can't have 700 secretaries of state, we have one? And is Roberts going to move on this, or do we need Congress to come in and clarify matters?
That's a great last point, Ed, because a lot of the fighting you're seeing is because Congress is absent. Congress actually, under the Constitution, under the Supreme Court precedent, it's not actually, it's amazing. If you look up the word immigration, it's not in the Constitution. There's nothing about the border either. The only thing there is the power of naturalization. And from that, the Supreme Court has said Congress has primacy over border control and immigration, but Congress has not done anything about the issues Mary's talking about or about the immigration flows. So what's happened is, and this is not just Trump, right? This started under President Obama, who introduced the DACA and DAPA programs, unilateral executive programs that pushed immigration policy in the direction he wanted rather than having Congress do it. Trump's now doing the exact opposite, but in the same way. He's also trying to push immigration policy in a much more restrictionist direction, but using the same claims of authority in a way that the reason why is because Congress is completely absent. Congress, anybody know when Congress passed the last immigration law? 1986. So Congress has not changed any immigration law despite the very big change in immigration as an issue and in raw numbers. And so what's happened? You have Congress absent, so anyone who wants to oppose what President Trump is doing is not fighting in Congress, they're going immediately to court. And one phenomenon we've seen, well, two. One is any single district court now, single district judge, you've got a bunch in Philadelphia, I know many of them. I wouldn't trust any of them even to be my Uber driver, not to mention set nationwide policy on immigration. And some of them, well, I went into high school with some of them. I definitely wouldn't let any of them be my Uber driver. Right, so you have, in our system, because it's unclear, you have some individual judges saying, I have the power to stop all national policy. Even though the people in front of me are just 5 or 6 people I could give relief to, I'm going to stop the entire policy. That's one big difference. The second big difference is, and we can talk about this, I think judges distrust Trump in a way they don't distrust other presidents. Usually, when judges encounter foreign affairs decisions by the president and the other branches, there's enormous deference. The person we were speaking in front of, Abraham Lincoln, at the start of the Civil War, he went ahead and took money out of the Treasury, he raised the military, he suspended habeas corpus, and he sent the military off to war without any participation by Congress. And when those cases came to the Supreme Court eventually, the Supreme Court said, this is not for us to review. This is for the other branches. You don't see those words being mouthed by any of these district judges. So the second thing is a lot of these district judges are subjecting foreign policy decisions, Ed's initial question, to a level of scrutiny that no previous president has ever had to suffer before. But that's because they don't trust Trump. I don't think Chief Justice John Roberts trusts Trump. I mean, in the first term, there were several decisions where the Supreme Court was not very deferential to the president. So I think what you're going to see happen is these decisions are going to get accelerated to the Supreme Court quickly. There's a case at the court right now where I think they will take away the power of district judges to issue these what are called nationwide injunctions, but on the promise that the Supreme Court will start deciding these things within a month. Rather than within a year, which itself is, light speed for the Supreme Court. And so the ironic thing is you're going to have the courts dragged in even more deeply into foreign policy decisions, which is, a lot of people say, judges, reviewing foreign policy decisions of the president and the Secretary of State, that's unheard of, but I think that's the new normal now.
So President Trump on the campaign trail said, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support this, had he won a second term, Putin would not have invaded Ukraine. Then he said, and as soon as I'm elected, we're going to negotiate this deal, we will bring this to an end. Well, it doesn't appear to have happened that way. And could you speak, both Mary and John, could you speak to the president's transactional nature, the idea that it's personal relationships that count in negotiating what are matters of long historical national interest?
You want me to go first? Well, I think all presidents are extraordinarily arrogant. Otherwise, you couldn't believe that you could be president of the United States. So I don't think that being arrogant and believing that you alone can bring about world peace is unique to President Trump, although it might be rather exaggerated. In the first term, I do believe that this is all hypothetical, of course, but the record suggests that no, Putin probably wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. Why do I say that? Because in the first term, the president reestablished deterrence over Moscow. We withdrew from the INF Treaty with, by the way, unanimous NATO support for all of the carping about how we alienated allies. All of the NATO allies supported that. I was in the room for it. It was remarkable to see. They went running around the room explaining how Moscow had broken the treaty repeatedly over a period of years, and all raised their hand and said, we support this action. So we withdrew from treaties that he was breaking. We threw his spies out of the country in concert with our allies. We launched missiles into Syria after we found out that they were aiding and abetting chemical weapons use there. We unleashed American energy, which took a lot of his revenue away because we became the price setter in energy markets, and we sanctioned his inner circle. And those were just actions that affected Russia itself. Separate to that, President Trump was establishing deterrence in other theaters, dropping, the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan and threatening fire and fury. Remember how the media thought how crazy that was? Well, yes, that was the point. You have to be afraid of your opponent in order to have effective deterrence. You have to have the means and the will. And he established that. And so Trump in his first term was the first president out of the prior four where Putin didn't invade another country. It happened under Bush and the neocons. Sorry, John. It happened under Obama. It happened under Biden. It is likely it wouldn't have happened under Trump. But that's past history, and we're dealing in the present. He has a different team around him with, as John correctly says, a very different worldview, which says that we need to negotiate with him. And I never believed the bluster about a deal on day one. It doesn't mean that the president won't take a harder turn toward Moscow if he's embarrassed by Putin. This is the one salient feature of a New Yorker. I mean, we're basically run by 10 square blocks of Manhattan. 10 square blocks of Manhattan is running the country. What do when somebody tries to take them for a ride? They yell at them, they sue them, and then they attack them. And that's how he's going to behave if Putin refuses to come to the negotiating table. Do I wish he had taken that stronger attack at the beginning? Yes, but this isn't the same group of people who are helping the president think through the foreign policy decisions. Maybe I'll just end there. John, do you agree? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your point about presidents. Trump is certainly not the first president who thought personal charm would actually make a difference in convincing countries to be more friendly to the United States. You might remember FDR thought he could personally charm Stalin, right? Personally charm Stalin into being reasonable about Eastern Europe and the post-war world. And Stalin, was not going to be charmed by anybody. Presidents Richard Nixon, Presidents Reagan, presidents have always, but think about, this goes to Mary's point about their being arrogant. Think about how we pick them. We pick them because they're really good with people, because even Nixon was good at faking he liked people, right? But we elect them because, we like their political personalities. They think that skill set applies to foreign affairs. And maybe it used to a lot more when there were monarchies and absolute governments, when one person really did control a country. But that's not the case. So I think Trump has that, but it's not unique to Trump. Lots of other presidents have had that issue too. The second point about transaction, and again, I think of Trump as doing things like a gas molecule. Sometimes he seems to act rationally, randomly, but it does seem to make sense to me if you agreed with the Trump administration's view that we are a declining power. I hate to say it, but I really think they believe that we are a declining power in the world. We can't sustain the commitments we've made to NATO or to East Asia, and so we have to fall back to controlling the borders, keeping our hegemony over Latin America, and preventing anyone from controlling the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Those are the three basic tenets of American foreign policy from the beginning of the country. The other things, like NATO, our allies, our institutions, I think they've been of great benefit for the United States. I think they've prevented war for you have to understand, we're still in a period where there's been no war between the great powers for 90 years. That's never happened in modern world history. It's been incredibly successful. Unfortunately, I think this administration thinks those are all too expensive now, and that it's not that they're going to destroy them, we're just going to walk away from them. And that, I think, in the long run will be actually more costly to us than if we had stayed committed. Because I think allies and institutions actually save us a lot of resources, time, and money if we can organize everybody to cooperate against the rising threat of China or the declining Russia.
Can I just make a quick statement about that, just to follow up on what John said? I think this idea of America as a declining power is rooted in the rise of the MAGA wing of the party that doesn't believe in supply-side economics, that doesn't believe that the pie grows. And so if you don't believe that our economy is vigorous, vibrant, resilient, that we can grow at 3, 4, 5%, then you have to revert to the worldview that John just described. And we saw the roots of this in Trump 1, when we saw elements of the right in Washington in the think tank community start to come up with the new right economics, which said, we want to spend money like Democrats, just on stuff that conservatives like. We don't mind taxing the rich if we take that money and spend things on things that conservatives like. And we too can play class warfare, which is why you hear the Treasury Secretary today speaking about Wall Street versus Main Street. That used to be the language of the political left, but now it's the language of the right. It's why you saw briefly mooted a new income tax bracket potentially in this reconciliation bill going through Congress, because they don't mind raising taxes if it's for things that they can spend money on. And so I think it all ties together, and I think one of the mistakes that's made when we think about US foreign policy is that we think of it as a singular vertical, totally divorced from economic policy, but they're linked. And one has influence, great influence on the other. And I think that this MAGA rise of this new right economics is basically resulting in the foreign policy worldview that John is so eloquently delineating.
John, you mentioned China's demographic decline. And Vice President Vance, when he spoke to the European Union, talked about two things. He talked about the clampdown on free expression within Europe. And there was also the tie to immigration, unchecked immigration into the European community, and what it is doing to the national characters of those countries. So Mark Stein, who 20 years ago talked about America alone and demography is destiny, speaks of London as his favorite Muslim city. These are serious issues, and it seems that some Europeans, the ones who are in charge, look down at the Trump foreign policy, but others who are pushing back against the European elites are very energized by it. Poland elected a president yesterday who was supported by Trump. He's going to be very strong on immigration. He's going to be very strong in dealing with the Russians. The Italians now have a prime minister who's of similar mind. And it seems as if Trump's influence in talking about making all of those countries great again by keeping them what they were has some currency today.
I don't ever want Germany to be great again. Poland, maybe. They got to have their turn at some point. I would look at it this way. I think Trump isn't the leader of the band. I think he and these other leaders, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, many of the leaders in Eastern Europe, and I think there's a big difference between what Secretary Rumsfeld called Old Europe and New Europe, where I think New Europe is much more American style in politics and much more friendly to the United States. But I think Trump and the rest of them are all products of this populist response to a lot of the economic changes that Mary was describing. In this respect, again, I don't think Trump is creating any kind of movement. I think he's reacting to the same kind of impulses that have affected the elections in a lot of European countries. And I would also add, look at the United Kingdom pulling out of the European Union and Brexit. Look at the rise of conservative parties, anti-immigration policy parties in France and Germany. So I think this is all happening at the same time because you have a lot of economic dislocation going on right now, and historically, populism is a common response. I do think that the United States has been different in that we've never really fallen to that siren song so completely as other countries have. You know, if there was ever a time that would have happened in our history, it would have been in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And we did elect one guy president 4 times. But we didn't really, I think, give in to the populist movement the way other countries have, because I think we our economy and our society escape this kind of trap of declining resources. America is incredibly innovative, and it's not directed by the government. We can't tell where, we can't tell where the next great American innovation and sources of rebirth are going to come from, especially if AI tells us what it's going to be. But who knew 5 years ago that AI would have this enormous change in our society? And it took place in the United States, not Europe, because I think our society is still decentralized and resilient in a way the European nations are not. So one last way of putting it, the answer to Ed is, I think the European systems, which are much more calcified and static, they're having a hard time figuring out how to respond to populism. I think our system, which is very decentralized politically compared to other countries, much more resilient, much more open to change and innovation, I think our system is going to adapt to these demands which are producing, I think, a much harder edged populism in Europe than it is here. Or at least that's my hope.
John, you mentioned AI, and there's a question from the audience. Is AI the next arms race between the United States and China, presumably? But talk about, Mary, you and John, talk about AI and how is it likely to impact American prerogatives around the world?
Oh, AI is the current arms race, it's not the future arms race. What is happening in Ukraine is the laboratory for it. We're entering a period of autonomous vehicles fighting our wars for us, of computer systems making decisions, being given a target and then said go find the target based on his face, etc. The power of what we could now do with these kinds of technologies is really mind-blowing today. The challenge that we face with China is that they have a larger population to collect data from so that their systems can learn. And two, they have no moral or ethical boundaries on the use of those systems or the testing of those systems. And three, they have an enormous web of relationships around the world where they can sell or give these systems to vast parts of the African continent, Central Asia, the Middle East, Asia Pacific, you name it. I mean, China is, I think now, the largest trading partner of more countries around the world than we are. Granted, they're not the most prosperous countries, but if you just look numerically, I think that is actually true. So they have several quote-unquote advantages, but our advantages, as John says, are amazingly dynamic, innovative, entrepreneurial system that has kept even our drone technology ahead, even though their drones were state-sponsored, took IP from us, copied us, and yet we have still somehow managed to maintain a technological edge in that technology. So our advantage is our system, our people, and the fact that the democracies and our friends and allies of the world are starting to wake up and want to help us. One of the great, I guess, successes of the president's trip to the Middle East was trying to get our AI stack adopted by strategically important nations in the Middle East and the Gulf that will sit in the middle of our bloc and the China-led bloc. And that's very important. At the very least, we have to stop these folks from tipping into their side and away from us. And I think the president's efforts on that last trip were an effort to do that. But the AI war is here, and we're already at war with China in the cyber domain as well. John?
I'm really an idiot because I wrote a book on high technology warfare in 2015. So it was like 7 years too early and nobody read the book. But I was like, you're going to see swarms of drones, you're going to see cyber warfare conducted that has no physical manifestation, you're going to see space. I wrote a thing about space weaponry, a chapter on space weapons in this book, which you can buy for 1 cent on Amazon.com now. I mean, I can't believe I wrote it so early. So the thing that I discovered in working on this book, which I think played to our advantages. I mean, I think we're scared of AI now, but if you think about it, it actually plays to our advantages, which we're seeing in Ukraine. It is making, if you think about it, it's making each human soldier more productive, just the way technology makes a human worker more productive. And making each individual more productive who can work with that technology appears so far to work to the side of defense, right? Ukraine is the one that's taking advantage of all these technologies to play defense, right? Now, maybe it's going to ultimately be helpful to the offense, but what we're seeing in Ukraine is World War I style fighting. But the reason why is because technology has taken away the advantage of the offensive that we saw, which the United States perfected, which the Russians tried to use in Ukraine and failed at. If that's the case, then that's a hopeful story for us with regard to China. Think about China. First of all, China is not a very peaceful country. They have attacked every neighbor around them. They've killed, in the Korean War, they killed 50,000 American servicemen, right? They are not by nature, communism is not by nature a peaceful ideology, right? And if you look at what China has done, what Russia's doing now, they have basically used human wave tactics. They try to overwhelm their enemy with human beings. AI and these new technologies are a way to make the defenders more productive to match China's, right, what they're doing, largest navy, second largest air force, to try to overwhelm with numerical superiority. So in the book, I argued that what worried me about the West was that we would be so scared of these new technologies that we would place limits on them too early. When we would fight opponents like Russia and China, as Mary said, they have no compunctions about using technology. They test them out on their own people first, like they've done in China and Xinjiang, right? Where they've used technology to surveil their whole population. So I urged in the book that actually we should focus on deploying these kinds of swarm drones, AI-enabled weapon systems as quickly as we could, because we're not going to spend the same amount of money to build as many destroyers as China. We're not going to match Russia with the number of artillery pieces we can field. But if we can make them all more accurate, and then the last piece, it leads to much more humane wars, because the AI and the drones, first, the best thing would be if they just fought each other and no human beings are involved at all, right? But second, they have made war much more precise. And so you don't kill hundreds of civilians, thousands of you don't destroy Berlin to try to get Hitler anymore. So actually collateral, this is another hopeful story. Since 1945, collateral deaths in war has dropped by an order of magnitude. Where people are dying in war is actually militaries killing civilians in civil wars. But when you have wars between countries, the amount of death and destruction has actually dropped remarkably because of the deployment of new technology.
John, the Houthis appear to have read your book, because
it's available in multiple languages around the world.
Our Navy has had a very difficult time dealing with the Houthis and what they've been able to do in terms of shutting down shipping. Are we learning fast enough, or are we too wedded to the notion of large carrier groups, fixed targets, the sorts of things that the Russians found out the other day could be defeated? And by the way, just clap. How many know what happened with Russia and Ukraine the other day? Very intelligent audience. So it's not that the Ukrainians drove those trucks over. They used regular commerce, so the Russian drivers delivered the vehicles to the appointed spot so that the trap could be sprung. Somewhere the Israelis were snickering because they said, we did it with pagers. So are we learning fast enough?
I would just say it's not the government and the Pentagon that are learning fast enough. Where you're seeing in the United States, in our system, where the advances are coming the fastest is private companies. So one of the great advantages the United States has in warfare is the use of space. The GPS system was initially created to allow for more accurate targeting by our artillery and missile systems. and where space is an asset that the United States has actually dominated and China's trying to challenge. Who has actually made space so accessible? SpaceX. If you look at the development of space, SpaceX's presence has dropped launch costs by 95%. NASA didn't do that. The government do that. If you look at where the development of swarm drones are coming from, it's from a company called Editorial. I don't know why Musk and his buddies name everything out of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but all these companies are named after weird things in the Lord of the Rings books. This company called so these private companies are the ones that are actually pushing the envelope. And so again, decentralization, I think, is going to be the key, not to focus all of our hopes in the Pentagon or, no offense, at the intelligence agencies. It's coming from private companies that are going to get contracts maybe from the government. And that's the story of World War II, by the way. Right? You look at the history of how did we mobilize for World War II. It wasn't the Pentagon of that day. It probably can't even name who the secretary, and by the way, it was called the Department of War back then. The Secretary of War was under FDR at the beginning. But who produced all the material? It was the head of GM who decided to build tanks. It was this guy named Kaiser who figured out how to build a Liberty ship in 3 days. These were all leaders of private companies that were able to do, and I think that's replicating itself now. So I'm glad if it's the Chinese government that's trying to drive weapons development in China rather than private companies, because I think centralizing it that way is going to make them more vulnerable.
So Mary, is this part of the Trump policy on tariffs to find a way to protect or build domestic industries that are going to be leaders in things that we need for national defense?
Well, it doesn't, that may be part of it, but you don't impose 10% tariffs on every nation of the world if that's your goal. I think tariffs are a core belief of the president, and you're seeing core Trumpism emerge in the second term. I mean, the president has many conflicting goals for the tariffs. One may be, yes, to get strategic industries reshored here in the United States. The second seems to be to protect American workers, and the third seems to be to bring prices down for blue-collar Americans. Well, you can't do all those things at the same time, and a tariff is a tax. I understood the China tariffs. When you have the world's second largest economy in the World Trade Organization, and they ignore all the rules, and they subsidize and they steal, et cetera, and there's no exit mechanism, what do you do? It's a really hard question to answer, and the president in the first term said, well, we will wield tariffs to get them to the table to force them to improve their behavior. And I think that's why you saw bipartisan support for that strategy on Capitol Hill, not just in Trump 1, but during the third term of Obama, because that was a very clear, understandable, commonsensical strategy. The tariff strategy now does not seem to be to just get strategic industries back to the United States. It seems to be, as John has, I think, very eloquently elaborated on, to retrench as many industries as we can. And I don't think that's going to work. And I also think it's very odd to just adopt an entirely defensive strategy rather than to look at what our advantages are, again, as John has described, which is our system. So why don't we have offensive strategies? Why don't we say, okay, we need not just basic defense industries and innovative tech and IT to stay here or to come to the United States, but other industries in the gray zone area, so maybe it's mapping technology and things that can be used in civil and military affairs, give them all tax breaks or start a special economic zone, or get together with industry groups and say, what is it that you need in order to be able to produce? Maybe it's not just here, maybe we produce with our friends and allies in concert. I mean, that was part of the thinking around AUKUS, Australia, the United States, and the UK. We would produce the submarines, we would get rare earths from Australia. I don't know what the UK can provide anymore. But you get the idea.
There are a couple questions about the Middle East, and specifically on the question of whether the Abraham Accords can be tied directly to what happened on October 7th. And by that, people are asking, is it just the attempt on the part of not just Hamas, but also its sponsors to derail any further expansion of those accords? And that leads into the question, our dealings with Iran. It seems that the administration either is playing its cards very close to the vest, or we're getting mixed signals on what we're willing to allow the Iranians to do.
I'll answer briefly, and then I'd like to hear
The
John.
Abraham Accords are your fault, so you should talk
Yeah,
about them.
okay. So the answer to the first question is yes, we do know for a fact that October 7th was an attempt to derail the expansion of the Abraham Accords. We also know that by lifting the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, Biden provided Tehran with the money and the running room it needed to mount the October 7th attacks. Second question?
Iran, the negotiations.
We've had 4 decades of experience with Iran since their quote-unquote revolution, and we've tried different tactics. We've tried under George W. Bush to let the Europeans negotiate with Iran. That failed. We tried under Obama to negotiate directly with Tehran. That failed. By the way, going around Congress, he simply did that using the power of the presidency, to John's prior point. That failed. We tried maximum pressure. That worked to a degree, and it facilitated the Abraham Accords, and it brought more peace to the region than we've seen in several generations. Now, President Trump seems to be moving back toward the Obama model, which is to start with diplomacy and to ease on the sanctions. And I think you can look at history and make a judgment that that's unlikely to work.
I would just add that the United States has not been able to pull out of the Middle East. You've had 3 presidents now who said, why are we so committed in the Middle East? And particularly, again, an administration that I think feels that we have overcommitted in the world and is trying to withdraw. You would think if we're going to withdraw, the first place we should withdraw from is the Middle East. Europe and East Asia are just much more important to our national interest than the Middle East. The thing that puzzles me is if we say we withdrew our commitments there, we didn't think it was even our place to try to control the Iranian nuclear program. At the same time, we try to restrain Israel from doing something about it. That actually really puzzles me, because you would think if Trump were to withdraw the United States from the Middle East, consistent with the Trump doctrine as I think it is this term, then the very least he should do is just say, okay, countries that are there, you handle Iran, and we'll sell you arms, but we're not going to try to place restrictions on Israel the way we have. I mean, the rumors are that Israel has wanted to conduct a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear program for quite some time, and the United States has stopped them from doing it. I think this happened even as early as the Bush administration, within which I served. But it would seem to me that Trump should just say, we're not going to try to interfere in the Middle East anymore in either direction, and let Israel and Iran, it's really for them to work this out.
But the tragedy of this is that you have Iran, Russia, and China at their weakest point right now. And so the administration is missing. I mean, if I were a neocon, I would say this is the time that you press them and you try for regime change. But I think they're going to miss that moment. And from what I understand, it's because of the influence of the vice president, who seems to think that the China threat is the most important threat. Good job. But he seems to think that it only exists in Asia Pacific, which is nonsense. It exists everywhere. If we pulled out of the Middle East, China would be patrolling the Red Sea in ways that the US Navy does today. They'd be very happy to do that.
We're going to have to leave it at that. And I should mention, there are so many questions that came our way. We apologize we couldn't get to all of them, which means that Mary and John have to come back so we can do that. And I'll leave the audience with a question that may be the most contentious one that could have possibly been asked tonight. We're not going to try to answer it today. It'll be for another time. It was directly to John, and it said, as a native Philadelphian, where do you take Mary for the best cheesesteak in this region?
Come on, we know the answer. It's Mama's in Bala Kinwood. Come on.
Ladies and
Pat's,
gentlemen.
Geno's, this new place, the Alessandra with the seeds on the roll. Come on, give me a break. That's not new.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Mamas.
let's
You heard it
thank
here.
Mary Kissel and John Yu for an outstanding presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen,